There we go. A nice warm morning to you. Wasn't it nice to see the 40s? I just love the sound of melting water, melting ice. We'll get started today. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for being here. And what we want to do today, we've been talking about the temple. We've been talking about the tabernacle, the 4 different buildings that are mentioned throughout the Bible. And one thing that I want to let you know up front is it's very important to adults when you learn to know why you're learning what you're learning. And if it hasn't become overly obvious, one of the things that I'd like to do is to never worry about a child crying. You're discipling that young child, so don't ever worry about that with me. But one of the things that I want to give you a picture in your mind. So when you read through the Bible, whether you're talking about the tabernacle, whether you're talking about Solomon's temple or Zerubbabel's temple or Herod's temple, you'll have a picture in your mind where you can then place those biblical events. And so we construct those pictures from obviously the Bible, number one, but then we can also put other resources that don't conflict with the Bible or give us additional insight. A lot of what you're going to hear today is from 2 primary sources. Number 1, the Bible. Number 2, Josephus, a Jewish historian. And number 3, the Mishnah. The Mishnah is essentially, it was compiled about 200 years after Christ, 150, 200 years after Jesus. And it's essentially a collection of Jewish sayings. It's an interpretation of how they interpret the law. In other words, if you have the law, then they felt the need to interpret the law and to give you some background of why they did what they did, and that's essentially what the Mishnah is. It's rabbinic teaching. To some degree, it can be convoluted. If you read the Mishnah, there's a lot of great history in there. It tells you a lot about rabbinic Judaism and the Second Temple period. So we take those historical resources and we put together a picture for you. And keep in mind, we never base our doctrine on apocryphal data or data that's not information that's not in the text itself. So we don't have anything to worry about there. Nothing about what we're teaching here is necessarily core to our doctrinal beliefs. But what it does do is gives you the picture. And when you have a picture in your mind, you know, it's amazing that you actually use both sides of your brain. You have a left side, it's very analytical, mathematical. You have a right side that's very artistic. It engages pictures. And when you engage pictures and you use both sides of the mind, you connect the networks in your mind in a more thorough way as opposed to just hearing about it and trying to imagine. So far from just curiosity, how many of you, from the pictures I've showed of Herod's temple, it was a little different than what you had pictured in your mind before? How many of you thought it was a little different? Okay, it was a little different. Sometimes people thought the temple was a really small place, like a little synagogue. It wasn't. The temple was huge. As a matter of fact, what you see on the screen, we could not have done probably 10 years ago. 20 years ago, no way, not in church. And I mean technologically. You are blessed because what we have in front of us is a 3D interactive picture that we can actually zoom into. And I'm going to take you on a virtual tour of the 1st century Temple Mount. And you can't do this. As a matter of fact, this is the first time I've even tried it with a group. And because we have such great AV techs and such a great setup here, it's enabled us to do this. So what you're looking right now is a picture of Jerusalem as it would have appeared right above. When Jesus was ascending to heaven, if he would have looked down, this is what he would have seen or saw. This would be a picture of Jerusalem, the walled city in the 1st century. And as you can see, the walls, the Temple Mount is the very large area here, about 1,500 feet across. This little area right here, you see that little subwall right there? Some of that still exists today. But this area right here, this is David's city. This is the original city of Jerusalem. And what Derek's going to do today is we're going to zoom in. But for right now, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overlay of the city of Jerusalem. Now, I have like 5 or 6 hours just on Jerusalem. So we're not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but what we will do is give you the crux of it. So this is David's city. This is what it was, and you can see what Solomon did. This would be the threshing floor that David bought. In addition, we see here this Temple Mount, as you saw last week, was greatly expanded by Herod. It was probably maybe 2/3 of the size, maybe around this area here, when Solomon had done his modifications to the Temple Mount. But this is in the day of Herod, and you can obviously see the big Greek structure here. They replaced the more Jewish plain structure with a Greek structure, and it's the center of everything. So when the disciples looked back and said, look at those massive stones, I did some research just to double check myself and to make sure that I would tell you right. But the stones on the back side of the western wall, there's a stone called the Western Stone. You have to go underground to see it. The stone is 570 tons. Now, the stone I showed you, it's one of the largest stones in the world known to man that's ever been moved without the benefit of mechanical machinery. So I'm just to give you an idea of how huge those stones were. I don't have a picture of it. You can go Google Western Stone and you can see it underground. The stone that I showed you last week is right there next to it. It's about 100 tons less, but it's still massive. And that gives you an idea of what Herod did. Let me give you a couple of just a few geographical points here. Number one, what valley is this? Does anybody remember? This valley is mentioned all throughout the Bible. Kidron Valley. This is the Kidron Valley. This is the valley that David would dance in, and this is the day when Solomon was king, and David put Solomon on the donkey to proclaim Solomon as opposed to Adonijah as king. This is where they say he rode his donkey up the Kidron and everybody in the city could hear. Kidron, a very famous city, a very famous valley. And you can see the ancient bridge. This would be the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where Jesus would have spent his last night, probably here and maybe even over a little bit in an area that this doesn't cover. Today, this is a little misleading because this is a big cemetery today, and you can see even here the gravestones that have been there for a long, long time. The Mount of Olives today is essentially just a huge cemetery. If you ever see the movie Schindler's List, Oscar Schindler was buried up there someplace, and they would put stones on his grave at the end of the movie. In Israel, you don't put flowers on a grave because the flowers are wilting just in the extreme heat. You put stones. Even today, if you go to a Jewish cemetery, someplace here, even in Lexington or Richmond, if you can find one, they'll usually have a little pot full of stones, and you can go and take a stone and you can go put that on the grave. And that actually comes from Joshua. I love to go to Jewish cemeteries and do little teachings on Joshua because their traditions came down even to today. So we have the Kidron Valley, we have David's city, we have the Temple Mount, and then we have several other notable geographic features. Number one, this valley right here is called the Tyropoeon Valley. The Tyropoeon Valley comes down to a place called the Pool of Siloam. We won't be able to visit that today, but that was a key place for fresh water. The spring of Gihon through Hezekiah's tunnel. Some of you have walked through Hezekiah's tunnel. Don't have a lot of time to talk about that today, but it came right through here and ended at the Pool of Siloam. The priests, for certain rituals at the temple, especially the ones at Sukkot, or what we call tabernacles, he would have walked out of the temple and all the way down about 1.5 miles to the Pool of Siloam to draw the living water, the moving water from the Pool of Siloam, and walk back up and do a ritual on the altar. There's several major facets of the city of Jerusalem at this time. Number one, we call David's city. Then we have the lower city. This is where all your common people lived. The common people, just everyday Joes, people who didn't have a lot of money, your worker bees, small business owners, things of that nature would live here. And you can usually tell by the archaeological remnants that the houses are smaller, not a lot of really big buildings in this particular area. But then you have the upper city. The upper city is where the rich folks lived. The rich folks, the aristocracy, as a matter of fact, this was built for Sadducees to walk from the upper city into the temple courts, this particular bridge right here. Right here, back in the back, this is Herod's palace. So when you think about Herod's temple, or this is where Herod would have stayed. His palace was back here, and it was a nice part of the complex here on the western side of the city. But also, it's also the upper part of the temple, or the upper city, was also where the upper room was, okay? So that gives you a little bit of an idea of where Jesus was for the Last Supper. Also, too, some people say that he was in an upper room, but it's also, think about it being in the part of the upper city. Caiaphas lived in that area, so the high priest lived up there. All these places where Jesus is being tried and taken are in that part of the upper city. Now, this would be the business district. A lot of businesses, little tiny shops that sold. If you go to Jerusalem today, I would imagine, except for the ice cream freezers, things look a lot different, or look very similar to what they used to. A lot of gifts, a lot of unique things. I mean, it is a shopper's paradise to go through Jerusalem and to walk through the old city. You can spend days in there, and if you're not careful, you'll get lost, and you will spend days in there. Because it's a lot of little, how many people have been there? You got those little narrow streets, but you've got these shops at just little booths. And it's a lot like a mall. You know how our malls, you walk down the mall and you got essentially these big square buildings or big square little subunits that all the businesses are in. Well, just decrease that by about maybe 5 or 6 times. And usually the little cubicles that they have in Jerusalem are just kind of long, maybe the width of a set of pews here, and you have an aisle down the middle, and it might go from here to the back, and that is your little cubicle to work. Very similar to a mall, but it's in the first century. Now, right out here is where Jesus most likely was crucified. It says he was outside the city gates. So, and this right here is a little escarpment, and that's Mount Calvary. Now, if you thought that Jesus was way up high on a big mountain and he got crucified, no, he was not. He was not on any type of huge mountain, but that was a raised place in elevation. It was a natural small mountain, hill, if you will. And this is where Jesus would have been crucified. Today, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre sits over this. An abandoned quarry is what used to be there. Now, isn't it amazing that the stone that the builders rejected was crucified on top of an abandoned quarry? You think that's a coincidence? I don't think so, but you be the judge. Today, people live here in Jerusalem at this time. Good question. At this time, when David's city was in, I've seen numbers around maybe 10,000. The number of people per square mile was incredibly condensed. It was very, very dense. A lot of people lived in a very limited size. Today, in this city here, and if you enlarge it, comes out to about here, you're looking at about 90,000 people live in the old city of Jerusalem. Back then, I think it was probably a little bit less than that, and I cannot remember the number. But I know the population today, but I do not know it back at that time. Now, I'll tell you this, Josephus, when you have a feast, a Passover, or some type of festival, Josephus tells us as many as 1 million people arrived in the city, and it was packed. It was a very, very exciting time to come to Jerusalem and to be a part of this. And of course, the centerpiece of that excitement is the temple and the services and the things that happen there. I mean, it would be, I don't know if you've ever experienced anything like that, but something that you've just looked forward to for months. As soon as it's over, you're ready to go back again. And this is what Jesus experienced when he and his family went in a caravan to the temple, to Jerusalem. And Jesus went to Jerusalem several times throughout his life. He was there at 8 days old. And that's amazing to me. At 8 days, my wife, after she had each of our 5 children, she was not ready to walk 4 miles. And it's about 4 miles from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to have Jesus circumcised. That is not an easy journey. Maybe she rode a donkey. I don't know. Even that seems to me would be relatively painful. But on the 8th day after Jesus was born, Mary and Joseph show up here at the temple to circumcise him and to offer several doves as a sacrifice, as is stated in the law. Yes, ma'am.
At the Last Supper, from there, and then you said where the Garden of Gethsemane would have been. About how far is that?
It's from here This is where Jesus would have done the triumphal entry. He would have came down, over, and up. It takes about probably 30 to 40 minutes to walk that. If you're walking fast, you might do it in 30 or 20.
With the elevation and stuff, how that was, because you were saying where the upper room, where they had the Lord's Supper. And then, of course, they went from there, they went to the Garden of Gethsemane. So I just wondered, how long a walk that was.
Yeah, it's about, I would say, and keep in mind, it's all has the crow flies here, but you're zigzagging through streets, you're going up and down hills. The elevation, I used to know that, and my mind slipped. I don't know the elevation. It's less than 1,000 feet. It's not a huge, I've hiked a lot and I've done elevation changes. The Mount of Olives is probably not over 1,000 feet of elevation change, if that. And there's a nice road that's graded that goes up there. Even back into those days, people came down from Bethany and Bethphage and came down. So that would have been a very well-traveled road that they would have maintained very well, even back then. So it's very possible, but keep in mind too, the distances and elevation to those people were very different. I'll tell you what, you go to Gamla, people lived on a hill. You go any place, you're going up and down, up and down. Those people were hardy. You had to be in shape to live back then. You really did. Their physiology, I imagine, was very different in regard to what they could withstand. The heat. You'll notice a picture, everybody would have wore something over their head. Everyone would have wore something over their head because the sun can just be intense on top of the Temple Mount in the middle of the summer, especially in something called Hamsin, where you got that Syrian wind that comes off those deserts. I've stepped off, the hottest I've ever been on my life was on the Mount of Beatitudes of all places. You would think it's by the Sea of Galilee, it would be cool. Not during Hamsin. Not when that Syrian wind comes down, and I got off the bus and it was worse than Las Vegas. It felt like a hairdryer about 5 hair dryers was in your face, blowing that hot, dry, arid air right into now it doesn't last a long time. Sometimes that'll stop and then it'll cool down, but it's still very, very hot. So, and then the hills, just think about this. Jesus went back and forth. It's almost 100 miles from Galilee to Jerusalem. Okay, I've walked 85 miles once in my life, okay, on a hike that I did on the Appalachian Trail. And I thought I got to the end and said, I'm done. And that was once. Jesus had to go back. Okay, so, and also too, it brings new meaning too when Jesus sat down with the Samaritan. Remember the Samaritan woman? He sits down at Jacob's well and he was tired from the journey. You don't know the half of it. You better believe he was tired, especially if he was a man. That is a long way to walk in the hot, dry conditions of Israel. People back then, you know how kind of older people are today? Kids are complaining about having to get up and go to school, or they have to get up at 8 o'clock. And the older folks say, well, I walked uphill both ways to school. And I walked in the snow barefoot. What are you complaining about? Well, it's something like that, I would imagine, that we don't know really what it took. Imagine just the baking. You could buy ground flour, but imagine all that you'd have to do to make your bread every day. The work that you had to do was just amazing when we consider it. And if we lived back then, it would take us some time to acclimate to that lifestyle. And the food that they ate, very lean, a lot of olives, a lot of bread, a lot of fish, some meat every now and then. Lamb was a luxury. They didn't have lamb every night. Lamb was something that was special. Wheat, obviously barley, they had food to eat, but at the same time, it was a lean food that you and I were saying, well, give me something that'll stick to my ribs. They didn't have a lot of the fatty, unhealthy type foods that we eat today. It was very different. Okay. So now that you have today the city, and where our time's half gone, so the city today is divided into 4 quarters. And the back part that you don't see here is the Christian quarter. Of course, it's the Christian quarters because where Jesus was crucified. Christians said, we want this quarter. The business district is the Muslim quarter. David's city is, what do you think? What part? Who claims David's city, this quarter of Jerusalem today, you think? Jews, absolutely. You got David's city. It's going to be Jews that control that. And then you have the upper city, which is an Armenian quarter. We go back into that later. So if we get to that. Now what I'd like to do is take you on the tour. Let's go ahead and press. Let's start over here at Robinson's Arch. We've come in from the city, and let's just click down here someplace. There you go. Tyropian Valley will be fine. So here you are. You've come into the city, you've walked, and you are now at the Temple Mount. You've walked, let's say, from Jericho, which is 15 miles uphill through the nasty, hot desert, and you have been waiting all year to come to the temple. It's an exciting time. You've got your friends with you. You're seeing people you haven't seen before. You're hearing people speak in all different languages. You're hearing babies cry. You're hearing all different types of sounds and noises, and you're smelling things you haven't smelled in a long time, or you haven't smelled. It's like a fair, and it's exciting. Let's turn around. If you can take your mouse and turn around. Yeah, don't click, just turn the mouse. Click and hold down and kind of, not in the square. Just click right in here and hold it down. Click, hold down, and then turn your mouse. There you go, our head. Ongoing. Roofs, people would have spent the night on the roofs of their houses. That's why and at night you would go out because it's too hot in the house. Go down just a little bit. Let's turn our head. The southern steps, Robinson's Arch. It's a temple. And all thing that's left is this has fallen. Some of the foundation. Remember that 470-ton stone I showed you last week? It's right. Okay? So that tells you where we are. As you look up at the temple, you're amazed, because right here what you're seeing is that these things right here are 50 feet tall. There are 143 of those. Single monoliths of marble brought from Italy. If you turn to your right just a little bit, Derek, you'll see the Hudla gates. A lot of rabbis would sit out here. Also, this building here, mikvah, baths that Jews would have had to had to bathe or had to wash off for ritual purity before they went into the temple, because you don't go into the temple unclean. The temple is a very clean, holy place that people just love. And again, just to see this massive building, it's, I took my kids to Chicago a while back because they hadn't really, they hadn't seen a big city, and we walked in through downtown Chicago, and they're looking up at, the Willis Tower and all these, the Trump building, and it's like, wow, this is huge. And it would have been the same thing for people visiting Jerusalem. The Hudla gates are named after the prophet Hudla in the Old Testament. Thousands of people would have streamed up in through here. Can you click on these little steps? We're going to go up into the Temple Mount, because let's see if we can't hover over that, or come back down here maybe. Any hot spot here that you notice? If not, let's forget that one for right now. Let's come back up here. Do you want to turn your head back this way? Let's go on. Let's go ahead and let's stop. Let's go on to the staircase. Let's work our way up into the temple. Now, we won't go into the court of the Israelites until next week, so you have to wait. But we're going to give you the whole tour the best that we can. Let's go ahead and click. Now, double click on this right here, and we're going to work our way up into the temple. Okay, you're going to have to turn your head again, because you're looking at the mikvah. Just work your way up that staircase. To the left. Left, further left. There you go. Keep working your way up that staircase. This is Robinson's Arch, a lot of shops and things like that. Very good. Okay. This would be now going into the Temple Mount. You are now on the southern part of the Temple Mount, getting ready to go in there. Let's go in here. We got Barclays Gate. This is going to be, actually, we took a hit back right here. It's taking you into the market. By the way, you can enjoy the same thing on your home computer. This is no commercial. You can enjoy the same thing on your home computer for $30. It's called the Glow Bible, and it gives you interactive tours. Let's go back again. Can you look over here? We're trying to get up. Here we go. Let's go up here. Access to the temple. There we go. Look there. And we're going to work our way up. And this gives you an idea of the size of this arch and the access to the temple. And again, when you think of temple, go on up to the Royal Stoa. This was a big deal. A big deal. And this is where God puts Jesus, in the middle of this system. Amazing. Let's go on up and access the Royal Stoa. Now, can you imagine being a kid and walking up those steps and seeing this? It's massive. Wow. Yeah.
Could everybody have gone up to this part?
Yes. Yes, they could.
Yes, they could. Yes, they could.
What is the sense of scale there? I wish you had some figures of people over here.
Yeah.
How tall would a person stand on those tiles?
Probably around that tall. 6 foot person, probably about that tall. And you're looking way down. I know this is 50 feet from here to here. So it's, and then on top of that, let's go ahead and click into the Royal Stoa.
Let's click in this little area right there on that hot spot there. Yeah. Now, that's a long way down. I don't know if you can see that. It's a long way. Sanhedrin after 30 AD would have met right down here. These are all gold capped columns, obviously very Greek. This is where the temple, there would have been buying and selling. Money changers would have been in there. And I'll tell you something else. When you have that type of covering, I'll tell you what, you don't appreciate shade until you're in the Middle East. I will tell you the shade of a rock, the shade of a stone structure. You go inside of a stone house in Bethsaida or Chorazin, and you are greatly relieved from the heat. That stone is a wonderful insulator, especially that basalt rock, this limestone, very, very, very good insulator, very nice, cool place to go. And guess where the church met? Where did the church meet in Acts? The porch. This is the porch. Or right around the corner, this is Solomon's porch. They would have come there. They would have sat on the ground probably. No padded pews. And they would have been able to participate in the worship. As a matter of fact, in Acts, it talked about how Acts 2, it talks about how they were continually at the temple. They were at the temple, and that's where they stayed after the resurrection. After Jesus says, you go back to Jerusalem. They went, and where'd they go? They went to the temple. Why'd they go to the temple? Because this is where it's all coming to pass. He's coming to replace all this. This is the center point of all of redemptive history as far as location goes. And that's where they go. All the disciples, they go back to Jerusalem, and they're at the temple all day. And this is the time when 3,000 people are baptized. Let's turn to the left slightly, and let's go out onto the Temple Mount. Yeah, let's go there to pathway to the temple. Let's go there. Right now, you're standing in the court of the Gentiles. You're seeing, remember those southern steps, those tunnels, the Hoodla gates that we talked about? They would go underground and then come up. And that's one of the places that are right over here. You could see they would come up. There were 2 of these places that would come up from underground. And when you would come up, let's go ahead and click on where it says court of the Gentiles right here. You would come up out of those those tunnels. Let's go ahead and click Solomon's colonnade, Solomon's porch. This is the places where the first church would have met. It's a gathering place. That's all it is. It's a place it's where God's glory resides. And you know something what's interesting to me is that even though the Jews, many of the Orthodox Jews, the real conservative Jews, didn't like the Greek structure that Herod had built, isn't it amazing that Jesus still held this building in reverence? As a matter of fact, he said, we're standing in the court of the Gentiles. This is where Gentiles could come. Let's go ahead and let's click on Solomon's colonnade. Okay, let's access to the courtyard here. Let's click there, and we can come back. And now you're standing looking northwest, and there's the temple. Now, I'm a Gentile. Now, Mark, in the cleansing of the temple story, the synoptic gospels, I think I can't remember how many it's mentioned in. I think it may be mentioned in two gospels, two of the synoptics, and once twice at least. I don't know if John mentions it or not. I can't remember. I don't think so. But Mark treats the cleansing of the temple differently. As a matter of fact, I do have that. It's I've got it right here. If you look at Mark 12, let's see. No, that's not it. The cleansing of the temple in Mark is different. I don't have the verse in front of me. And you'll notice that Mark says something and he adds something that Jesus says that the other gospels don't have. Now, here's the interesting thing. Matthew, I don't believe, has it. Luke doesn't have it. And I can't remember if it's mentioned in Matthew or Luke, but it's one of those two. I think it's mentioned in Matthew. And Jesus says, "You've turned my Father's house, into a den of robbers. Don't make my Father's place a marketplace." That's what he says in the Gospels that are to the Jews. When he's talking, now who's Mark written to? Different audience. Who is the Gospel of Mark written to? Gentiles, Romans. And in Mark, Jesus adds something. Jesus says, "You've turned my Father's house, into a den of thieves. Don't make my Father's place a marketplace," essentially. And then he adds this phrase. He says, "For my Father's house," and he quotes, I believe this is from Isaiah, "my Father's house will be called a place of prayer for all nations." Okay? For all nations. So in other words, when he's talking to Gentiles, Mark wants to emphasize that when Jesus cleansed the temple, he was doing this for Jews, but he was also doing this for Gentiles. Because where are you? If you're a Gentile, you just walk through the biggest commercial place that you've ever seen. You've seen people probably gouging other people, and you come, and this is as far as you can go. Remember that stone I showed you last week from Istanbul? It's there now. That when the Turks controlled Egypt, they found all the archaeological stuff they could take, and they took it back. Same way with the Brits. I mean, you go to the British Museum and you just see some amazing stuff in the British Museum. So anytime you conquer the Holy Land, you get to take whatever you can find in the time you're there and take it back to your home. It's pretty sad that you have to go to Istanbul to see something from Israel, but so it is. So those stones would have been right here. Those stones, when you entered in, those stones with the warnings for non-Jewish people to enter would have been right here, and there were 12 of them all throughout. A few things you're going to look up and see. You see these lamps? Each one of these lamps, according to the Mishnah, has 5 gallons of olive oil that they put up there, and they burned. The wicks were part of priestly robes. So in other words, the robes that the priests would wear, those were consecrated, and they would actually cut those up, and they would burn those as wicks, and it would create this massive light inside the court of the women. That's the court that you're seeing right there. And those lights would illuminate the entire court of the women and the Temple Mount. And it's amazing that if you look at the Festival of Lights today and the dates, and you look at Jesus when he's at the temple and he says, "I am the light of the world," it's during that festival. Jesus takes those things that have been a part of Jewish history, and he claims them for his own. I'm the light of the world, not this. Let's go ahead and let's make our way into here. Okay, let's turn to the left just a little bit. And I want you to picture a man begging because he's been crippled, blind. And this is where those healings take place. It's where Peter heals him. Peter heals the crippled man at the Gate Beautiful. So you come to here, you are about to enter in. Now, when you go in here, you and I could have never gone in here, because this is, unless you're a domineering general from some foreign army. As a matter of fact, I think it was one of the generals after the sacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD records in Josephus that he actually goes into the Holy of Holies and he couldn't see what all the fuss was about. It's an empty room. So now we're going to take a step into a very holy place. Let's go ahead and click into the court of the women. And you would have only come in here, as a matter of fact, if you would have come with a sacrifice, say with a lamb, you would have gone through the northern doors, okay? That's where they would line people up to process them. So let's go on up the steps, and now you can see the Nicanor gates. You have seen these gold-plated gates. It was a donation. Nicanor, people think that that's the name of a man who gave the money to do it. He was from Egypt, evidently. But these doors were massive. It took several people to even open them. And the Nicanor gates, these are the 13 steps going up to the temple. The priest would have came out here and he would have essentially administered services. They would have had a choir here. They would have had musical instruments. They have a whole room for musical instruments and the worship processional inside of the temple. A few things here. This place would have been packed, standing room only for some of the events. Now, in 2 weeks, actually it'll be 3, the last week, we're going to do, I'm not going to be here next week, but the week after that, we're going to do Passover, which is going to take you behind into the court of the Israelites, and we'll actually go into the temple, and you'll get to see the awe of the temple. Especially behind these, I think some of the most compelling things about the temple are behind these gates. I hope I'm whetting your appetite, because I think it's the lesson I look forward to the most, because if you don't fully understand the Passover, you will in an amazing, amazing way when you look at it in the context of the temple. So let's spend the rest of our 3 minutes here in the temple. Let's just mouse in on these little shofarot over here. 13 of these. I shared this a little bit with you last week. This is when Mary would have made her way into the temple. Let's just mouse in on these right here. Just turn and just mouse in. With the wheel. Mouse wheel. There you go. Great. See how those things look like little trumpets? Zoom in just a little more. There you go. See the little boxes that go into the wall? And they look like trumpets. You see there? Where you throw your money in and it, those are called the shofarot. That's where you would place your offerings. Let's go ahead and turn our head a little bit to the left and look at the other side. There's 13 of them there. 1, 2, 3 or 4 is where Mary would have come to put her offering for the 2 doves that she needed to offer for the birth of Christ. So that's where she would have come. This would have been the place where Anna and Simeon would have been. Anna and Simeon would have been here. This is where they would have seen. This is where Simeon would have come up and said, now I can die because I've seen the Christ. Over here, each of these places, we had 4 courts. Remember, there's a lot of let me just ask you this in the closing. What do you remember from last week? There's several courts, 4 courts in this court of the women. Now, the court of the women is only as far as the women could go into the service. The women could not pass back through the Nicanor gates. That's where the men went to do their sacrifices and things like that. And if they're doing the sacrifices, they would come through another door. But what do you remember? What do you remember from last week? There was 4 courts, and those courts are essentially in this drawing. They don't show you specific courts, but they show you doorways in each of the corners. Do you remember what those courts were? The court of the lepers, when Jesus heals the leper and says, go to the priest and show him, this is where he would have come. Okay? He would have had to go through all that we just been through, walk up to the city, go up there and show himself clean. Okay? What else do we have? Court of the lepers. Cord of the wood. The people who had skin blemishes, the priests who weren't, they would discriminate. If you had eczema or you had some gash or you weren't in some form perfect to serve, they said, oh, well, no worries, you can sort the wood. And you would still been able to go and sort the wood that would have gone to and inspect the wood to ensure it was good wood for the altar. And the altar, the priest, according to the Mishnah, competed for the tasks at the temple. I mean, when it says Zechariah got to go minister in the temple, that is no accident. That is divine sovereignty that he was placed there because he was lucky to be able to serve. The Mishnah tells us they would draw straws to serve. It would be awesome to serve on the altar or to be able to go inside and minister with the menorah or with the altar of incense. Oh my goodness. And then only the high priest, of course, could go in too. But to minister inside the holy place, oh, this is a dream come true. I've worked my whole life to be able to partake in this ministry at this time. Wow. So this little business about just Zechariah being able to minister in the Holy of Holies, that's divine sovereignty. God placed him there. It was not luck. He was there at a specific time, at a specific place, for a specific task. Look, just tilt up just a little bit. These little buildings to the side later, you have bakeries in there. You have, like I said, rooms for musical instruments. You have meeting rooms for the priests. You have their overnight facilities where the priests would spend the night. You have all different types. Priests when they would come there to serve, they would be there for a while. And remember too, they would have places to bake bread, to serve the priests. Keep in mind, what did the priest eat? The priests ate a lot of the sacrifices that came through, some of the offerings that were, it was rare that they stuck a whole bull on if you look at the Passover offering, they ate the Passover offering, they burned the fat. They weren't throwing the whole bull on top of the altar. If you thought that in the past, that's also a misconception in the case of the Passover and other offerings. They would gut the sheep and take the big fat chunk out, and that's what they would burn. But they wouldn't burn the innards. They wouldn't burn the intestines or the unclean parts. They would take those to outside the city and put those in a ceremonial clean place. So now that we have less than 30 seconds left, week after next, you do not want to miss. Because I think for me, when I shared the lesson that I did, my dad wept when he saw what he saw about Christ in the context of the temple. I'll just never forget that memory of my dad learning what he did about the temple for the first time and then putting it in context to Christ. And it just puts a massive foundation for who Christ is and what he does in our life. It's real. And all the archaeology, all the life points to that, and you're going to see that. But I know we got a special treat for you next week. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You'll just have to wait till then. Somebody else will be teaching, but it's going to be good. I know this person. Let's pray. Lord, forgive me for going over, but thank you so much for this day. Thank you for your temple. And just continue to bless us, Lord, and help us to ensure that we all know that we are your temple as the church and as people. And we keep ourselves clean and in order and in harmony with you. In Jesus' name, amen.